Alright, so let's go ahead and animate this. First, I want to get rid of this annoying texture control. And so you just select it, and you can go into Display and go down to Hide and choose Hide Selection. And then voila, it's gone. Let's start the animation by going to a different view. It's a lot easier to get precise on the movement if you're going in one direction by going to the side view. Select floor, and let's go to the 4-panel view, and you can see, because we had moved these before, that they're still in those positions. So let's mouse over each one, press F for that one, mouse over the front view, press F, and then mouse over the side view, press F. Okay, and we're going to use the side view, so keep the mouse in there and press space bar, and let's zoom out or dolly out. Well, in this case it's zoom out. Again, you can use the scroll wheel, push it forward so that the camera goes back, and then to position it, hold down the Option key and hold down the scroll wheel or middle mouse button, and you can position it. Now select the ball, because we're going to animate that. And we want to turn on the auto key function. So that's down here and almost in the lower right. That's this little guy right here. And click on it and it'll turn red when it's selected. And make sure that in the timeline you're at the first frame. And we're going to start where the ball is positioned now. And that'll be our first keyframe. So press S for your first keyframe. And you can see then you've got a little red hash mark there at the first frame. At this point, it should be set at 120 frames are visible, and then over here shows the maximum or the total at 200 frames. And you can click on this slider here on that button and it'll zoom out so that you can see all of them if that's what you want to do, or zoom back to the original 120. You can also slide forward in time or back in time. So we'll make this animation to be 6 seconds long, which means we'll be at frame 120. So go there to frame 120, make sure that the ball is selected, and we're going to move the ball down to its, well, at least close to its final position. We're going to do a lot of tweaking in between here. And again, as I said at the beginning, we're going to do a pose to pose rather than straight ahead principle of animation. Press the W shortcut button for the move tool and click in the middle here. And since we're in an orthographic side view, it'll only move in two-dimensional direction. So let's take it down right about to here and release. So that's 4 grids in from the end. And if you're nice, maybe we'll even fall off out of the screen. Now you can see that at frame 120 we have automatically gotten a keyframe there because we had auto key set, and it automatically adds a keyframe when we move to a different position. And now if you go back to frame 1 and then scrub through it, you can see we have our animation. A 6-second animation. Let me show you something here. Okay, so if we play this, click on the arrow for the play button, you can see it's playing in real time. Yours might not be set that way, so it's taking 6 seconds to play through. Now click stop. If yours isn't playing the real time like that, then you need to change the setting. So right click anywhere on the timeline and choose playback speed, and if it's not selected, select real time. It usually defaults to play every frame, so make sure it's at real time, and that way you can get a good idea of the actual speed that it's going to play in its final render. Our first bounce is going to take 1 second, so let's move in half a second, and that'll be our first hit on the floor. And so let's click and drag, and we're still in the move tool. Let's click and drag it down about, let's start off with 5 grids in. And we're just going to eyeball it here because we're going to be tweaking it later on anyway when we fine tune it. So you can see again we've got another keyframe that added at 12. Now let's go to frame 24. That'll be 1 second in, and let's take it back up about here. Again, we're just eyeballing it for now, going to rough it out, and then we'll tweak it later. So you got 1 bounce, bounce 1, and that looks pretty good. But let's take it up a little bit higher, maybe up to about here, so we have somewhere to go with it. Let's see how that looks. Yeah, okay. In the real world, it'll lose energy as it bounces, and then each subsequent bounce will be shorter in distance as well as faster in time because there's a shorter distance. So rather than each bounce being 12 frames, we'll cut it down to 10 frames. So let's go, our next bounce will be at 34 frames. So that'll be down. Let's take it down this time about 4 grids this way. And then let's go another 10 frames to 44. And let's take it up around here. And let's see how that looks. And the next one will be 8 frames. So let's go to 52. Let's take it down. And again, it's losing energy. And 60 is the next one. And 66 is the next one. 72 is the next one. 76 is the next one. And 80 is the next one. And 84. And then let it fall off all the way out of camera, out of the scene. I have to zoom back a little bit so we can see what we're doing at about 100. And we'll probably move the camera around so that we can watch its progress off screen partially. Alright, so let's scrub through that. I'm going to get rid of this keyframe at the end of 120 because I changed my mind. So click on it, right click on it, and delete. Okay, so let's scrub through that. We can see we've got some bouncing happening. And off. Okay, that looks like fun. Make sure that you save on a regular basis. So Command S or Control S on Windows. Now, and also I want to save this as a separate version of the bouncing ball file. So let's go into File, Save Scene As, and we're already in the Scenes folder. So Bouncing Ball 1, let's change that to Bouncing Ball 2. Save As. And then that will save in that Scenes folder in the project window. Alright, so now we need to do a little tweaking. Let's play this. Press the Q key first, so it's just, we don't have the move tool arrow on there. Okay. That's not too bad. Not totally realistic, but that's okay at this point. Now you can see it has sort of that look like it's almost sliding. It's not, but it's, the bounce maybe needs to be a little bit sharper. Plus we need to add some squash and stretch to it. So let's go to frame 13. And when we do that, well, you can see it has moved forward from frame 12 by about half a grid. So let's choose the move tool and let's move it back to where it just was, and let's move it down just for now. Now we're going to add some squash and stretch to this. So we'll begin with squash. So the idea here is that at frame 12 it hit the surface, and then at frame 13 it starts squashing. Press the R key. We're going to scale it down. And we'll scale it out this way. Remember in our principles of animation that if with squash and stretch, if it loses volume in the height, then it has to gain volume in the width. So let's go into the perspective view. Press spacebar. Now let's go into perspective. And so again, holding the option and the left mouse button, you can see we stretched it in the Z direction already in the side view, but we need to also stretch it a little bit in the X direction to even it out. So now we've got a realistic looking squash happening. And of course we need to bring it down again to the surface. So let's go back into the side view and let's bring it down to the surface, maybe even take it down a little bit inside of the surface, and let's see what that looks like. But you notice, since we don't have any other keyframes in the scale attribute, that it maintains that all the way down there. So we need to set that. Let's go back to frame 12 and click on the channel box, and let's change the scale. Now you can select all three of those by clicking and dragging through them, and then just press 1, and then it'll take it back to the original shape. And notice that where it has keyframes, that it's bright red at that point. So now when we scrub through, we see it is back to its original shape, and then we get to frame 13 and it squishes or squashes. And it's looking fairly realistic. Now at frame 14, we want it to start going back up, but we want it to happen fairly gradually. So we got a stretch happening about halfway through. So let's go to frame 18. And let's give it a stretch in the Y direction. So press R and stretch it up that way. Since we've stretched, we need to compensate for the size in the volume in perspective. So we'll go that way a little bit. And again, we're just kind of eyeballing it. If it's really way off, then we can always compensate for it by tweaking. So let's see how that looks. Bounce, squash, up, stretch, and then reaches its peak. And now at that point, it should be back to its normal shape. So let's go to frame 24. And in the channel box, let's click and drag to select those three and press 1. Now it's back to its original shape. Bounce. A lot of times in animation of the bouncing ball, you'll see it stretch coming back down to, I prefer to have it what I think is more realistic looking when it bounces back down, that it'll repeat kind of the same pattern that we had before in the bounce look. So on our second bounce, I think we bounced a little too far, so I want to move this back to the middle here. I think that is more realistic. At least kind of spreads out the movement a little bit. Let's go to frame 33 and let's take that to that point at the center of the grid, and That's good. Then let's go to frame 34 and let's do our squash and stretch again. And go over to perspective and stretch out in both directions. Let's take it down to the surface, and again you can let it overlap a little bit, gives a little bit more of a squashy look. Alright, then we need to compensate for that, since none of these other ones have the scale changed, so we have to do it as we go along. We could go in there and add a little bit of add a keyframe for the scaling, but that's not a big deal. Okay, so we have this squash, so we need to go to this frame again, and let's select those 3 channels of the scale, press 1, and that's right. So when it first hits on this bounce, then it's back in its right position or right shape, and gets a little squash there. And then halfway through at say 38, let's stretch it back out again. Let's go into the perspective view and let's compensate for the volume change. Side view again. Alright, so coming down, hitting, squashing, coming back up and stretching. And it gets up to the peak again, and let's go over here in channel box and type in 1 so that it's back to where it's in its original shape. And we're just repeating as we go through here. So I'm going to play this and see how it looks so far. I like that. Okay, that'll work. So in this next bounce, we're going to add another squash and stretch. So one of the ways we can avoid having to double work is, let's go to frame 51 and let's just tweak it a little bit. Let's go into the channel box in those 3 channels, and let's just change that to 0.99. for all 3 channels. And so it hardly changes it, but at least it sets the scaling so that it doesn't distort all the other ones. So let's take that down. Let's move this even with the grid, and we'll have it hit the surface there. So scrubbing through, bounce, and then you can see between frame 50 and 51 and 52, then it's like it's sliding, so we need to move it back. Go to 52 and let's move this back to even with the grid centered, and let's squash it and bring it down. Press W to move it down, and R again for our scale. Let's go into the perspective view and let's do our compensation for the volume like we did before. Okay, back to the side view, and let's take a look at that. Okay, so now again we need to let's go to frame 60. Let's type in 1 on the channel box so it goes back to its shape, and let's give it a little stretch here at frame 55. Go to perspective and compensate. Back into side view. So again, these bounces are getting smaller and closer together. So we'll let this one be right at the middle of this grid, because we don't want to change the shape of the movement. All right, and let's do like we did on that last one. Let's type in 0.99. Click and drag. 0.99. And you can see it hardly changes the shape of it, but it adds the keyframes to those scales. That's at frame 66. Let's do the same at frame 72. Let's go to frame 68 or 69. I think 69 will be okay on this one. And let's scale it up for the stretch. Maybe not quite as much. Let's go to perspective and compensate. All right, and then let's see what we need to tweak now. So we got frame 66 there, and let's go to frame 67. It's frame 67, and we need to move it back to the same position that it was at 66, and let's squash it. So we got it coming down, squash, and then before we stretch it, let's go to 72 and let's change that back to the original size. In between we go and give it a little stretch. So we got 2 more bounces before it goes off. So we're at frame 76. That's right, almost exactly there on that, centered on that grid. And let's type in 0.99. That adds the keyframe there for the scale. And let's go to frame 76 now, and let's move it back to where it was in the previous frame, as we have been doing. Squash, perspective view, compensating, back to side view. That's at our peak right there. We want to type in 1. And since this bounce is so small, I'm not even going to bother doing the stretch. We'll do one more squash as it hits here on frame 84. So let's type in 99 on that. 0.99. And on the next one, we take it back to where it was, the previous frame. Squash it a little tiny bit since it's almost out of energy. And on this last frame of the last bounce up, that's on 88, we'll change that to 1. And it is going to disappear. Of course, we'll be rendering this, the final render, in the perspective view. There it is. So let's play this through. Let's click off of it so it's not selected so we can get a better idea of what it's going to look like. And zoom in a little bit and play. And it looks pretty organic. It almost looks like it's anticipating jumping off, like it's on a diving board or something. And yeah, we could animate the board to move like a diving board, but that'll be for another tutorial. And so we'll finish there for this tutorial. Then we're going to, in the next tutorial, add some reflections and shadows.